the clinking of ice in a glass, a flight attendant's smile that stops just short of one passenger, a captain who makes a decision before listening. At first glance, it was nothing more than a request for a glass of water. But on that winter afternoon, high above the clouds, what unfolded was far more than a service slip. It became a test of dignity, a test of professionalism, a test of how far arrogance and prejudice can push an entire system off course. What happens when a flight crew mistakes calm resolve for defiance? What happens when a black woman, quietly powerful, yet weary from years of subtle dismissals, is underestimated one time too many? And what happens when that woman is not just a passenger, but one of the most powerful safety officials in aviation? This is not simply a story about an argument at 35,000 feet. It is a story about truth, accountability, and how one act of disrespect unraveled an entire airline. Before we dive into this powerful journey, don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the stories that reveal just how much one voice can change. The low hum of the aircraft cabin was a sound Dr. Selena Carter knew by heart. To most passengers, it was background noise, the steady vibration of a machine preparing to break gravity. But to her, it was music. It was the sound of physics conquered, of human beings trusting metal and math to carry them across the sky. For years, she had devoted her life to making sure those sounds meant safety, progress, connection. On this Sunday afternoon, though, it was simply the background to exhaustion. Selena had just finished 3 grueling days in Chicago, combing through the maintenance records of a struggling regional carrier. The work was tedious, but her role demanded it. As the Deputy Administrator for Aviation Safety at the FAA, she was responsible for the integrity of an entire industry. Every log she checked, every inconsistency she flagged, had the potential to save lives. All she wanted now was a few hours of peace on her flight back to Washington, D.C. She had a critical Monday briefing waiting for her, and a mountain of directives still to review. A glass of water, a quiet seat, and her tablet would be enough. Selena found her place in Seat 2B, a first-class seat booked by her department. She wasn't picky about airlines. She flew wherever duty sent her. Today, it happened to be StratusJet, a newer player in the luxury budget market, a company known for sleek branding and cut-rate fares meant to lure business travelers. The seat looked plush at first glance, though the cushion was firmer than expected. She slid her slim leather briefcase under the seat ahead, exhaled, and tried to let the stiffness leave her shoulders. The boarding process unfolded in a rhythm she knew well, rolling suitcases, bumping knees, apologetic smiles, the shuffle of passengers settling in. A senior flight attendant moved through the cabin with clipped authority. She had a severe blonde bob, a name tag that read Claudia, and an expression carved from practiced condescension. Her posture radiated the air of someone who believed the cabin was her kingdom. Selena watched as Claudia offered pre-departure drinks to the portly businessman already hammering away on his laptop in 2A, then to the laughing couple in row 1. Claudia's eyes swept right past 2B, as though Selena were invisible. She waited. She had learned patience long ago. In classrooms where she was the only black woman, in boardrooms where her title of doctor was met with raised eyebrows. Maybe Claudia was just starting at the front, Selena told herself. But then a younger attendant, Ethan, his uniform crisp and his expression eager, came by with drinks for the passengers in row 3. Selena raised her hand politely. "Excuse me?" Ethan stopped, startled. "Yes, ma'am. I'd just like a glass of water. Please. No ice." His relief was visible. "Of course," he said, almost smiling. and turned toward the galley. But before he could take 2 steps, Claudia's voice cut through the cabin. "Ethan!" It wasn't loud, but it was sharp, and it froze him mid-stride. He shuffled back, face pale, as Claudia leaned in, whispering in low, furious tones. Selena could see them reflected in the window. Claudia's gestures pointed in her direction, Ethan's shoulders collapsing as though the weight of the cabin had suddenly doubled. When he returned, his voice was thin. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said without meeting her eyes. "We're pausing pre-departure service right now to assist with boarding." Selena frowned. That didn't make sense. She had just watched Ethan serve row 3. "I see you were just serving them," she said evenly. "Is there a problem?" Ethan hesitated, his glance flicking toward Claudia, who now stood with arms folded near the galley. "No problem," he muttered. "We'll resume once we're in the air." The familiar sting of indignation pricked Selena's chest. She had carried this feeling her entire life. The subtle dismissals, the quiet assumption of lesser worth, the little ways people signaled she didn't belong. Usually she ignored them. You couldn't fight every battle. But then Claudia returned. She leaned over to the man in 2A. Her voice sugared. "Mr. Davidson, may I get you a refill on that scotch before we push back?" Davidson grunted his approval. Claudia disappeared, then reemerged with his drink. The ice clinked against the glass, the sound sharp in the cabin silence. She set it down with ceremony, turned, and walked past 2B without a glance. It was deliberate, calculated, not an oversight, but a decision. Selena closed her tablet. This wasn't about water anymore. It was about professionalism, about standards. In aviation, small things mattered. A crew that dismissed one passenger's rights could easily dismiss something far more important, like a warning light, or a co-pilot's concern. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood. Her presence carried a quiet authority, the kind that came from decades of being underestimated but never defeated. She stepped into the forward galley where Claudia stood wiping down counters with theatrical detachment. "Excuse me," Selena said, her voice even. "My name is Dr. Selena Carter. I'm seated in 2B. I believe there's been a misunderstanding." Claudia turned, her smile thin as glass. "Is there a problem?" "Yes," Selena replied calmly. "I requested a glass of water and was told service was paused. Then I observed you serving the gentleman in 2A. I'd like to understand why." Claudia's lips curved into a sharper smile. "We are prioritizing StratusJet Platinum members first. Everyone else will be served after takeoff." It was a lie. Selena knew it instantly. She had overheard Davidson at the gate complaining that this was his first StratusJet flight, forced by his regular carrier being overbooked. "That's an interesting policy," Selena said, her tone controlled. "Could you show me where it's written in your customer service charter? Because I've reviewed it. It makes no mention of tiered pre-departure service." Claudia's composure cracked. Anger flashed in her eyes. "Are you calling me a liar?" "I'm asking for clarification," Selena replied, her gaze unwavering. "Your airline is bound by specific service standards. You seem to be deviating from them. I'd like to know why." The air tightened. Claudia's voice sharpened. "You're creating a disturbance. Return to your seat." Selena's reply was quiet, but unyielding. "I will, once I either receive the service I am entitled to, or a policy-based explanation for why it is denied." The standoff thickened the air. Passengers nearby shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension. Ethan hovered at the edge of the galley, his hands wringing, eyes darting between the two women. And then Claudia made her decision. She reached for the intercom. "That's it," she snapped. "I'm calling the captain." Selena felt the weight of the moment. She had seen this before. Truth twisted into accusation. Professionalism recast as disruption. She took a breath, bracing herself for what was to come. The glass of water was no longer just a request. It had become the spark that would ignite a storm, one that Stratusjet could not imagine was about to consume them. When the intercom clicked and Claudia Reynolds' voice rose in tight indignation, "Doctor," Selena Carter knew what was coming. A disruptive passenger report. It was the classic escalation, the last refuge of a crew member who had already lost control of the situation. Selena returned to her seat with measured calm. She didn't slam her briefcase or sigh loudly. She sat down, smoothed her slacks, and folded her hands in her lap. To anyone watching, she looked like exactly what she was, a professional woman waiting to be treated with the same dignity as every other paying passenger. The cabin door opened with a quiet click. Out stepped Captain Mark Hastings, his frame tall but slightly stooped from years in the cockpit. His uniform was pressed sharp, silver mustache trimmed, and his stride carried the authority of someone who believed his word was law. He walked into the galley where Claudia was already gesturing toward 2B with an air of triumph. Hastings looked at her first, not at Selena. "What's going on here?" His tone was calm, but beneath it ran irritation, the kind of impatience reserved for weather delays or late fueling. "Captain," Claudia said quickly, "this passenger left her seat, refused to comply with instructions, and has been aggressive toward me. I'm concerned for the safety of the flight." Aggressive. The word stung like a slap. Selena's breath caught for a moment. She had said nothing louder than a measured question. She had stood without raising her voice, without a single hostile gesture. Yet here she was, painted as a threat. She rose smoothly, facing Hastings. "Captain, that is not accurate. I requested a glass of water. I was told service was paused, yet observed other passengers being served. When I asked for clarification, I was accused of causing a disturbance. I have been calm throughout this exchange." Hastings finally turned his eyes toward her. They scanned her up and down, taking in her neatly tailored pantsuit, her tired eyes, and her dark skin. His expression was paternal, almost patronizing, as if addressing a child who had misbehaved. "Ma'am," he said slowly, his voice dipped in condescension, "my crew is responsible for the safety of this aircraft. Their instructions are not suggestions. If they tell you to sit, you sit. If there's a concern about beverage service, we can address that once we're safely on the ground in Washington. Right now, let's not delay 87 other passengers over a glass of water." The dismissal was total. His gaze slid back to Claudia, never once asking for further facts. He had already chosen his truth. Selena inhaled through her nose, centering herself. Years of engineering had taught her that structure fails not because of one dramatic crack, but because of the small stresses ignored until collapse. This was no longer about water. This was about the culture of safety itself. "Captain Hastings," she said, her voice even, though steel lined every syllable. "The issue is not the water. The issue is the arbitrary and discriminatory application of your airline's own policies. Furthermore, your lead attendant has made a false report about my conduct. That is not only unprofessional, but a potential violation of FAA regulations on crew integrity and passenger safety." The words seemed to tighten the air. Claudia stiffened. Hastings' jaw set hard. To him, it was not fact. It was a challenge. Is that a threat, ma'am? He asked, his tone mocking. Are you planning to report me to the FAA? I am stating facts, Selena replied. Her calmness was deliberate, a contrast to his rising defensiveness. You have a crew member who fabricated a story about a passenger. You have endorsed that fabrication without investigating. That is unsafe. Passengers nearby had gone silent. The man in 2A, Davidson, cleared his throat. For God's sake, Captain, just give the woman her water. What's the big deal? Claudia's eyes shot daggers at him. Sir, please remain out of it. The couple in row 1 whispered to each other, their voices just audible. She's been calm the whole time, the woman said. This is wrong. But Hastings had locked into his course. His ego was fully engaged, his authority challenged. He was not about to bend. I'm not asking again, he said, his voice final. Return to your seat, or you will be removed from this aircraft. Selena felt the eyes of the cabin on her. She stood tall, her mind racing through the implications. The refusal to investigate, the willingness to brand her a threat, the precedent it set. If a captain dismissed facts in something this simple, what would he do in a true emergency? Her weariness dissolved, replaced by clarity. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about everyone in that aircraft, and everyone who would ever board another Stratusjet flight. Very well, she said evenly. You may remove me, but I will need your name, Captain, and the names of your crew. You'll get them from our complaint department. Hastings snapped. He nodded at Claudia. Call airport security. Selena gathered her briefcase slowly, deliberately, as if each movement were a record of dignity. She did not argue. She did not plead. She allowed the silence to deepen until the air itself seemed to hum. 2 airport security officers arrived minutes later. Their expressions were apologetic, their body language weary. Ma'am, one said softly, we need you to come with us. Selena nodded. She walked past the rows of staring passengers, past Claudia's smug satisfaction, past Captain Hastings' steely glare. As the jet bridge swallowed her, the cabin door hissed shut behind her. To them, the problem was solved, the disruption removed. The flight could continue, but Selena felt a surge of calm. They had just failed the most important audit of their lives, and she was the examiner. She stood at the gate window, watching as Flight 712 prepared for pushback. The ground crew released the chocks. The jet bridge withdrew with a groan of hydraulics. The plane rolled slowly back, carrying with it a captain and crew who believed they had won. Selena reached into her briefcase and pulled out her secure government phone. The device was plain, black, built for function, not style. She scrolled to the top of her contacts. David Langford, FAA Administrator, her boss. It was 4:15 p.m. Central Time. He would be preparing to leave his office in D.C. She pressed dial. Langford, his voice barked, brisk as always. David, it's Selena. Selena, I thought you'd be in the air by now. Everything all right with the audit? The audit is fine, she said calmly. The flight back is not. I've just been removed from Stratusjet 712 at O'Hare. Silence. Then a sharp intake of breath. David Langford knew Selena Carter well. She was unflappable, meticulous, never prone to drama. For her to be removed from a flight meant something catastrophic. On what grounds, he asked, his voice suddenly tight. Selena gave him the facts, stripped of emotion. The refusal of service, the invented platinum member policy, Claudia's escalating hostility, the false accusation of aggression, Hastings' failure to investigate. She cited specific FAA regulations, reciting chapter and verse from memory. The core issue, David, she concluded, is not the discrimination. That was the trigger. The real danger is the demonstrated inability of the captain and senior crew to follow protocol, to de-escalate, or to make an unbiased judgment. Their entire command structure is compromised. I have zero confidence in their ability to safely operate this aircraft. Langford was silent for a long beat. When he spoke again, his voice was steel. Where is the flight now? Selena looked out the window, pushing back. Stay where you are, he ordered. I'll handle the immediate situation. Then I want you to go to the O'Hare FAA field office. A team will meet you there. We're opening an emergency probe into Stratusjet, starting with this crew. I already have their names, Selena said quietly. Captain Mark Hastings, Senior Flight Attendant Claudia Reynolds. Good, Langford replied. They're about to have a very bad day. Selena ended the call, watching as the aircraft trundled toward the taxiway. Inside that cockpit, Hastings likely felt vindicated. Claudia was probably gloating in the galley. They were secure in their little bubble, blind to the storm about to break over them. Her phone buzzed. A text from Langford. ATC has been contacted. Flight 712 is returning to gate. Await FAA officials. A slow smile touched her lips for the first time that day. Out on the taxiway, the plane slowed, stopped, and then began to turn. The storm had arrived. Passengers had just settled into their seats, tray tables stowed, devices switched to airplane mode, when the captain's voice came over the intercom. Folks, this is your captain speaking. We've been instructed by air traffic control to return to the gate due to an unforeseen administrative matter. At this time, I don't have additional information, but we'll keep you updated. We apologize for the inconvenience. Confused murmurs rippled through the cabin. A woman clutched her husband's arm and whispered about mechanical problems. The man in 2A groaned loudly, slamming his laptop shut. Others glanced toward Claudia Reynolds, hoping for explanation. But she offered only a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. Claudia could feel a knot forming in her stomach. This was not normal. Administrative delays usually meant paperwork or weight and balance corrections, not a full return to gate after pushback. Something was wrong. As the aircraft eased back into position, the jet bridge rolled forward and locked into place with a metallic thud. The door opened, but it wasn't a gate agent who stepped in. Two men in dark suits entered with quiet authority. Their badges flashed as they moved past the threshold. One spoke clearly, his voice cutting through the hum of whispered speculation. We are with the Federal Aviation Administration. We need to speak immediately with Captain Mark Hastings and Senior Flight Attendant Claudia Reynolds. The rest of the crew and passengers will need to deplane and await further instructions. Gas filled the first-class cabin. Claudia's face drained of color. Captain Hastings emerged from the cockpit, his jaw set hard. What in the hell is going on? He demanded. The lead agent, a man named Henderson, remained composed. Your flight has been grounded pending an immediate safety and compliance review. You and Ms. Reynolds will come with us. Your operating certificates are suspended pending investigation. The words landed like blows. Certificates suspended? For Hastings, it was as though someone had just torn the stripes off his shoulders. For Claudia, it was a nightmare she had never imagined being pulled off a flight in front of passengers. Her authority stripped bare. This is insane, Hastings sputtered. Over what? A passenger complaint. The grounds will be explained during your formal interview, Henderson said firmly. Now, please come with us. Claudia's knees felt weak as she followed the agents, the eyes of the cabin burning into her back. Hastings walked stiffly, his pride the only thing keeping his spine straight. Behind them, the second agent addressed the crew and passengers. This aircraft is not to be moved. Effective immediately. The entire Stratusjet fleet is under an emergency operations stand-down order. All flights nationwide are grounded pending a preliminary review of company-wide training and conduct protocols. The announcement sent shockwaves through the cabin. Passengers stared at one another in disbelief. Nationwide grounding. Over a single incident, Davidson in 2A cursed under his breath. Unbelievable. My meeting's blown. Others murmured anxiously, pulling out phones to call loved ones, to tweet, to record. The story was already spreading before the plane had even emptied. Back in the terminal, Selena Carter stood by the window as the jet bridge filled with passengers shuffling off in confusion. Some glanced at her, recognition dawning. She was the woman from 2B, the one they had tried to paint as a problem. Selena felt no triumph, only a steady focus. The dominoes were falling exactly as they had to. This was not vengeance. This was accountability. Within an hour, the story hit news wires. Social media lit up with photos and videos of FAA agents boarding the plane. Hashtags bloomed, Stratus grounded. Flight 712, bar dignity, in the sky. Witnesses began uploading their accounts. Some defended Selena immediately. Others were cautious but intrigued. Everyone agreed on one thing. Something extraordinary had just happened. In the O'Hare FAA field office, Selena sat at a long table with Director Morales and a team of investigators. Passenger statements began arriving. The man from 2A confirmed she had been calm and professional, describing Claudia as on a power trip. The couple in row 1 corroborated her account. Even Ethan Morales, the young flight attendant, admitted in hushed tones that Claudia had pulled him aside, instructing him not to serve Selena. The picture was becoming undeniable. Selena leaned forward, her voice steady but urgent. I want a full audit of Stratusjet's training programs. De-escalation, crew resource management, implicit bias. Pull every complaint filed against their crew in the last 5 years. We need to see how many were investigated and what actions were taken. A crew does not behave like this unless they feel untouchable. We need to find out why. Director Morales nodded grimly. Understood. Meanwhile, in Dallas, Stratusjet's corporate headquarters was in chaos. CEO Harold Whitman slammed his fist on the boardroom table, shouting at his COO. Grounded the entire fleet. For one incident, one passenger, his assistant rushed in with a printed notice from the FAA. Whitman scanned it, his face blanching. The order was initiated following an incident involving Dr. Selena Carter, Deputy Administrator for Aviation Safety. The name hit him like a thunderclap. Every executive in the industry knew Selena Carter. Brilliant, incorruptible, relentless, the one regulator you never wanted to cross. Whitman sank into his chair, suddenly aware of the scope of the disaster. They hadn't just insulted a passenger. They had declared war on the very woman empowered to dismantle them. As reporters swarmed outside the Dallas headquarters, inside the FAA office in Chicago, Selena reviewed preliminary findings. Brenda's, no, Claudia's personnel file told a damning story. 19 formal complaints over 12 years. 8 citing discriminatory behavior. 2 involving false accusations of aggression. Each one dismissed. Each one filed away under crew acted in accordance with policy. She turned the page to Captain Hastings' record. 3 separate first officers had requested transfer from his flights, citing a hostile cockpit environment. No investigation had been conducted. He had been a senior captain with no accidents, so the company had let it pass. Training records were worse. The so-called mandatory de-escalation and bias training consisted of a 15-minute video, clicked through while employees multitasked. Digital records showed batch uploads of completion certificates, a clear sign of falsification. And then came the maintenance files, Selena's area of expertise. Spot checks revealed skipped procedures, falsified sign-offs, and even unapproved replacement parts installed to save money. A whistleblower mechanic confirmed what she already suspected: a systemic practice of pencil-whipping safety checks. Selena closed the file slowly. It was all connected. The arrogance in the cabin was the same arrogance in the maintenance hangars. A culture that believed rules were optional, that expedience mattered more than safety or dignity. She looked up at the team around her. This isn't about one flight attendant or one captain. This is about an airline that fostered a culture of impunity. They taught their employees the rules didn't apply. Whether it was about serving water or inspecting an engine, the outcome is the same. This is a systemic safety failure. Director Morales nodded, his expression grave. Then it looks like StratusJet's future is about to get very short. Selena felt the weight of her words. She had pulled a single thread, and the entire fabric was unraveling. What began with a glass of water was exposing an airline built on shortcuts, arrogance, and lies. And she knew, deep down, this was only the beginning. The newsroom at Channel 9 in Chicago had barely finished the evening broadcast when the breaking banner hit their screens. FAA grounds StratusJet fleet. The anchor blinked twice, then read aloud with barely disguised excitement. We are just learning that StratusJet Airlines has been ordered to ground its entire fleet pending an FAA safety and compliance review. Sources tell us this stems from an incident on Flight 712 earlier this afternoon. By midnight, the story was everywhere. Cable pundits debated whether the FAA had overreached. Social media users created memes of Claudia Reynolds' frozen smile as federal agents boarded the aircraft. Videos posted by passengers were clipped and reshared until they reached millions of views. In Washington, David Langford leaned over the polished table in the FAA's crisis response room. His voice was sharp but controlled. Selena, your report says the captain sided with the flight attendant without verifying facts. That alone would justify suspension. But the preliminary audit points to much deeper problems. I need to know how far this rot goes. Selena Carter sat opposite him, her expression calm but eyes burning with purpose. We have evidence of systemic failures. Fake training, ignored complaints, falsified maintenance sign-offs. This is not a customer service problem. David, it is a safety culture collapse. If they can ignore their own rules about respect, they can ignore rules about turbine inspections. Both have the same consequence. People die. Langford exhaled, pressing his palm flat on the table. Then we treat this like a full-scale safety threat. You're in charge of the investigative task force. Build me a team. Move fast. Selena nodded. Inside, she felt the familiar tug of conflict. She did not want to be the story. She had not boarded that flight to make headlines or humiliate a crew. All she had wanted was a quiet glass of water and a seat home. Yet fate had pushed her into the spotlight. She reminded herself of the truth if she turned away. Others would pay the price. In Dallas, CEO Harold Whitman raged in his glass-walled office. Grounded. 128 aircraft parked because of some regulator on a power trip. This is insanity. His chief operating officer tried to calm him. Harold, it's not just one regulator. It's Selena Carter, deputy administrator. She has authority. And from what I hear, she has witnesses backing her. Whitman waved a hand dismissively. Passengers exaggerate. Crews are under stress. We can spin this. We apologize. We retrain. We're back in the air next week." But even as he spoke, his phone buzzed with alert shareholder calls, canceled bookings, news headlines with the phrase "systemic failure" flashing across the ticker. Whitman's empire was cracking before his eyes. Back in Chicago, the field office filled with stacks of paper and open laptops. Investigators pulled personnel files and training logs. They interviewed mechanics, junior flight attendants, supervisors who had quietly kept records of warnings ignored. One name surfaced again and again: Claudia Reynolds. Her file was a ledger of unheeded alarms. Complaints from passengers who described her calling them agitated or unruly when they had done nothing more than ask for service. Reports of her singling out travelers of color. Yet each case had ended with the same corporate conclusion: employee acted in accordance with policy. Ethan Morales sat trembling across from the investigators, his hands twisted together, his voice low. "She told me not to serve her. Dr. Carter. She said some passengers don't need extra attention, that if I insisted, I'd regret it. I didn't know what to do." The lead investigator leaned in. "You're telling us she ordered you to withhold service?" "Yes," Ethan whispered. "I was scared. I followed her lead. I shouldn't have. I'm sorry." Selena watched him with a mix of disappointment and compassion. She saw in his eyes what she had seen countless times before: in young professionals, the paralysis of fear when faced with toxic authority. He was not malicious. He was weak. But weakness, unchecked, still cost lives. Meanwhile, in Denver, the probe into maintenance practices opened a darker chapter. A mechanic named Ben Alvarez slid a folder across the table to federal agents. His voice shook. "These are copies of work orders I saved. Look at the sign-offs. Whole inspection skipped. Parts swapped with cheaper, unapproved components. We called it pencil whipping. If you slowed down to do it right, you lost hours or got reassigned. Supervisors called it efficiency. I called it gambling with lives." Selena read the documents with a tightening jaw. Every falsified log was another betrayal of trust. Every skipped inspection was a silent countdown to disaster. By the end of the week, the picture was undeniable. StratusJet had not simply made mistakes. They had built a corporate culture that rewarded arrogance, punished integrity, and treated rules as inconveniences. Langford convened the crisis board. The air was thick with tension. "Selena, summarize your findings." She stood, her voice steady but firm. 19 complaints ignored against Reynolds. Multiple first officers requesting transfers away from Hastings for hostile behavior. Training modules reduced to 15-minute click-through videos. Falsified completion records. Widespread use of unapproved parts and falsified maintenance logs. This is not isolated. It is systemic. This airline does not operate safely. The room fell silent. Langford finally spoke. "So what you're saying is that a refusal to serve a glass of water was not the root. It was the symptom of a disease." "Exactly," Selena replied. "Disrespect breeds negligence. Negligence breeds catastrophe. StratusJet is a clear and present danger to the flying public. Across the country, passengers stranded by the grounding-filled terminals with frustration. Yet as news outlets revealed the depth of the investigation, frustration turned to outrage. Families who had once flown StratusJet began to wonder what risks they had unknowingly taken. Selena sat in her hotel room that night, the city lights of Chicago glowing beyond the window. She thought of her parents, who had raised her with the mantra that dignity was non-negotiable. She thought of the young black woman she had seen in the front row of inspector training months ago, eyes bright with ambition. She thought of every passenger who stepped onto an airplane trusting that those in charge valued their lives. She felt the weight of what was coming. Stratusjet would not survive this. Thousands of jobs would vanish. Families would suffer. And yet to let the airline continue would mean gambling with lives. She whispered a quiet promise to herself. Better pain now than tragedy later. The following morning, headlines confirmed the inevitability. FAA sources indicated the agency was moving toward indefinite suspension of Stratusjet's operating certificate. Analysts called it a corporate death sentence. Investors fled. Employees wept outside shuttered crew bases. Claudia Reynolds sat alone in her apartment, television flickering. She watched pundits dissect her sneer frame by frame, turning it into the face of corporate arrogance. She told herself she had been the victim, that the passenger had provoked her. Yet deep down, she knew. This had been her doing, and the reckoning had only just begun. At dawn, the terminals were already crowded with stranded travelers. Screens across the country blinked red with the word canceled. Some people shouted at gate agents, demanding answers. Others slumped against their bags, resigned to the chaos. In Atlanta, a father tried to calm his crying daughter, whispering that they would get to Grandma's house eventually. In Los Angeles, a businesswoman furiously typed emails on her laptop, her meeting in New York already slipping through her fingers. The media feasted on the confusion. Cameras zoomed in on exhausted families and furious executives. But the narrative shifted quickly once the reporters explained why the airline had been grounded. The footage of Dr. Selena Carter walking calmly off Flight 712, flanked by security officers, played on repeat. Commentators pointed out her title in bold letters, Deputy Administrator for Aviation Safety. The story was no longer about inconvenience. It was about betrayal. In Washington, Selena faced a bank of microphones outside FAA headquarters. She did not crave the attention, but the moment demanded clarity. Her voice was calm, deliberate. This action was not taken lightly. Safety is the cornerstone of aviation. When evidence shows that culture and compliance have broken down, we act. We will pursue this investigation to its conclusion. She stepped away before the shouted questions could drown her, knowing the statement would be replayed across the nation. Behind closed doors, the hearings began. FAA investigators summoned employees one after another to tell their stories under oath. Ethan Morales sat nervously at the long wooden table. His voice cracked as he admitted what had happened in the cabin. "She told me not to serve Dr. Carter. She said we only take care of certain passengers. I felt sick about it, but I was scared to cross her." One of the panelists asked, "Did you believe her orders were against policy?" Ethan swallowed hard. "Yes, I knew. I didn't want to lose my job." Selena listened from the back, her face unreadable. Inside she felt the familiar mix of sorrow and resolve. Ethan's weakness had enabled injustice, but his honesty now was a step toward redemption. She hoped he would learn to stand taller in the years ahead. Next came mechanics, carrying binders and flash drives. They described skipped inspections and doctored signatures. One man showed photographs of worn engine components stamped with fraudulent approval codes. Another admitted he had been told to reuse parts scavenged from grounded planes. "We called it recycling," he said bitterly, "but we knew it was gambling with people's lives." The evidence piled high, a mountain of negligence that no lawyer could scale. Meanwhile, CEO Harold Whitman scrambled in Dallas. He convened his board in a glass tower overlooking the skyline. "We can survive this," he insisted, sweat glistening on his forehead. "We'll fire the crew, pay a fine, and relaunch with a new slogan. People forget fast." The lead director, a seasoned investor named Margaret Pierce, stared him down. Harold, this is not a PR problem. It is existential. The FAA has proof of systemic fraud. Wall Street is finished with us. You've lost the confidence of everyone who matters. Whitman slammed his fist on the table. I built this airline from nothing. You can't take it away. Pierce slid a folder toward him. Your resignation letter. Effective immediately. Sign it. For the first time. Whitman looked small. The bravado drained from his face as he realized his empire had collapsed. He signed with a trembling hand. Back in Chicago, Claudia Reynolds arrived at her own hearing in a stiff navy suit. She told herself she would look composed, professional, untouchable. She sat tall before the FAA panel. Her smile practiced. I acted in the best interest of cabin order. She declared, the passenger was challenging my authority, and I took steps to maintain control. That is my duty. One panelist raised an eyebrow. Your duty, Ms. Reynolds, is to follow established protocol. You fabricated a non-existent policy about platinum members. You misrepresented a passenger's behavior as aggressive. You misled your captain. That is not maintaining order. That is dishonesty. Claudia's smile faltered. I have 12 years of service. I should not be destroyed over one misunderstanding. The lead panelist lifted a thick folder. This is not one incident. This is 19 complaints over a decade. 8 citing discriminatory behavior. 2 accusing you of inventing threats. Everyone dismissed by your employer. Today, the pattern ends. The words were final. Claudia felt her chest tighten. For years she had believed herself protected, valued by management for her so-called firmness. Now she saw only the wreckage of her career. Captain Mark Hastings fared no better. At his hearing, he leaned back in his chair, radiating confidence. I made a judgment call. The senior attendant reported a disruptive passenger. I supported her to maintain authority in the cabin. That is my prerogative as captain. A former Air Force colonel on the panel leaned forward. Your prerogative, Captain, is to exercise sound judgment. You failed. You never asked the passenger for her account. You ignored obvious contradictions. You escalated instead of de-escalating. That is not command. That is arrogance. Mark scoffed. So I lose my license because I trusted my crew. The colonel's eyes hardened. You lose your license because you failed to lead. You are a liability in the cockpit. The verdict was swift. His license revoked. His career ended. Selena returned to her office that evening. The city bathed in twilight. She poured herself a cup of tea and let the silence settle. She should have felt victorious, but instead, she felt the heavy weight of consequence. Thousands of employees would soon lose their jobs. Families would face hardship. And yet she knew the alternative was worse. To allow StratusJet to continue would be to gamble with lives. Her phone buzzed with a message from David Langford. Press release scheduled for morning. Indefinite suspension of certificate. We end this tomorrow. Selena stared out the window, whispering softly to herself. It began with a glass of water. It ends with an airline erased. The next morning, the FAA announced the permanent grounding of StratusJet. The news rippled through the industry like a shockwave. Analysts called it the largest collapse of a U.S. carrier in decades. Airports removed StratusJet logos from gates. Competitors circled like vultures, preparing to buy aircraft at auction. Passengers cheered the decision online, praising the FAA for protecting safety. Advocates called Selena a hero, yet she brushed aside the labels. Heroism had never been her aim. Integrity was. She thought again of that cabin, the ice in the glass, the refusal of service, the moment when a line had been crossed. From that small indignity had flowed an entire river of truth. And truth, she knew, had the power to ground even giants. By the time the sun set on the second day, the name Stratusjet had become shorthand for corporate disgrace. Cable networks aired montages of grounded planes baking on tarmacs. Hashtags calling for justice trended globally. What began as one passenger's humiliation had grown into an international parable about arrogance and accountability. On Wall Street, the reckoning was brutal. Stratusjet's stock, once valued as a rising challenger to the majors, dropped like a stone. Investors fled in panic. Pension funds liquidated positions. Analysts described the collapse as faster than anyone had imagined. $1 billion in market capitalization vanished in hours. By evening, financial tickers ran a single word beside the company's name: worthless. In Dallas, the once gleaming headquarters resembled a bunker under siege. Reporters crowded the sidewalk, cameras flashing as executives hurried in and out. Inside, the mood was grim. Harold Whitman, still clinging to a shred of authority despite his resignation, paced the boardroom. "We can rebuild," he insisted, voice hoarse. "We'll relaunch under a new name. Restructure the debt. Spin the story as government overreach. People love an underdog. Margaret Pierce, the lead director. Cut him off. Harold, stop. The government did not do this to you. You did this to yourself. You built a culture of shortcuts and cover-ups. You made people like Claudia Reynolds untouchable. You ignored every warning. We cannot spin rot into gold." Whitman's shoulders slumped. For the first time he admitted defeat, though he would never say the words aloud. Across the country, the human toll spread. Mechanics received text messages informing them their shifts were canceled indefinitely. Gate agents were told not to report the next morning. Families stared at pay stubs that would soon be useless paper. In break rooms and union halls, workers cried and cursed, torn between fury at management and fear for their futures. Selena Carter followed the coverage from her Washington office. Each headline felt like another weight pressing on her chest. She had not sought the destruction of an airline. She had sought only truth, but truth, once revealed, had consequences. She reminded herself that safety came first, always. Still, the faces of ordinary employees haunted her. She promised silently to find a way to soften the blow for those caught in the collapse. Meanwhile, Claudia Reynolds spiraled, stripped of her job and her flight attendant's certificate. She spent her days drafting furious statements online. In her mind, she was the real victim, sacrificed to appease a mob. She granted an interview to a local news station, claiming she had been set up by a passenger with political motives. The segment aired once, then was drowned out by a flood of evidence proving otherwise. Screenshots of past complaints, testimonies from colleagues, and video clips of her sneering face during the incident became viral memes. No union came to her defense. Friends stopped calling. Within weeks, the woman who once strutted through cabins like a queen found herself filling out applications at roadside diners. Captain Mark Hastings retreated into bitterness. His license revoked. He sold his home to cover mounting legal bills. His wife filed for divorce, exhausted by years of his arrogance. Former colleagues avoided him, whispering about the cautionary tale he had become. One evening, he stood alone in his garage, staring at the uniform that once commanded respect. The gold stripes now looked gaudy, like a costume from a life that no longer belonged to him. He felt a hollow ache in his chest, not just for the loss of career, but for the truth he had refused to face until it was too late. For Ethan Morales, the aftermath was different. His cooperation with investigators earned him a reprimand rather than permanent expulsion. For months he worked odd jobs, humbled and chastened. But eventually another airline hired him into a retraining program. This time, the lessons were real. Scenario-based drills forced him to confront his fears, to speak up against misconduct, to see himself as part of a team instead of a bystander. Each day in the classroom, he remembered Selena's steady eyes in that cabin, the way she had stood calmly against injustice. He promised himself he would never again remain silent in the face of wrong. The broader industry took notice. CEOs called emergency meetings. Union leaders demanded reforms. Safety consultants circulated memos warning that culture was as critical as maintenance. One headline in the New York Times captured the mood, "The Carter Effect." When integrity grounds an airline. Selena's phone buzzed constantly with messages from journalists, senators, and advocacy groups. She avoided the spotlight where she could, but she agreed to testify before Congress when summoned. The hearing chamber was packed with reporters and cameras. She spoke plainly, without flourish. What happened on Flight 712 was not about a glass of water. It was about a crew that believed rules did not apply to them, and a corporation that taught them to think that way. When arrogance becomes policy, safety is compromised. Our duty is not only to inspect rivets and engines, but to inspect culture. Respect and professionalism are not optional. They are safety requirements. Her words echoed beyond the chamber. Advocacy groups quoted her in press releases. Pilots discussed her testimony in cockpits. Flight attendants debated her in break rooms. She had become, reluctantly, the face of a movement. Late one night, alone in her apartment, Selena sat by the window, city lights flickering beyond the glass. She replayed the events in her mind. The chill of Claudia's stare, the condescension in Hastings' voice, the humiliation of being let off the plane. She remembered her own trembling hands clutching the briefcase, the moment she had to choose between silence and confrontation. She thought of her father's words, spoken long ago when she was a girl. Dignity is not given, it is claimed. That memory steadied her. She had claimed her dignity, not with shouting, but with facts, patience, and resolve. And in doing so, she had uncovered rot that might have killed others. At the FAA, the investigation closed with a final report thicker than a dictionary. It detailed fraudulent maintenance practices, sham training programs, and systemic bias. The conclusion was stark. StratusJet posed an unacceptable risk to public safety. Its certificate was revoked permanently. Selena read the last page slowly, then signed her name at the bottom. The case was over. But for her, the work was only beginning. She drafted the framework for a new initiative, one that would make sure culture was monitored as rigorously as machinery. She called it the Professionalism and Inclusivity in Aviation Safety Program. She knew the fight ahead would be brutal. Lobbyists would sneer at the costs. Executives would dismiss it as unnecessary. But she had the truth on her side, and truth was a force that could not be erased. The story of StratusJet would fade from headlines eventually. Planes would be repainted, gates reassigned, lawsuits settled. But Selena Carter understood that the real legacy was not the collapse of one airline. It was the reminder that safety begins with respect, that arrogance in the sky endangers everyone, and that one quiet voice, steady and unflinching, can change the course of an entire industry. That night, as she prepared for bed, she whispered again the words that had carried her through dignity is not negotiable. In the weeks that followed the collapse of StratusJet, Washington became a hive of activity. Committees called emergency hearings. Airline lobbyists crowded hotel conference rooms, plotting how to contain the damage before it spread to the rest of the industry. Editorials filled newspapers debating whether this was a singular failure or a symptom of something larger. For Dr. Selena Carter, there was no debate. She had seen the rot up close, and she knew it was not confined to one carrier. Each morning she arrived at the FAA headquarters before sunrise, a coffee in hand and her briefcase heavy with documents. The silence of the empty hallways gave her a few minutes of peace before the storm of meetings began. On her desk sat a handwritten note from her assistant, reminding her of the day's agenda, a meeting with David Langford, the administrator, followed by sessions with the Congressional Oversight Committee, then a briefing for the press. David Langford leaned back in his chair as Selena entered his office. He was a man known for his clipped sentences and relentless pace, but with her he slowed down. He respected her judgment, even if he sometimes feared how uncompromising it could be. "They're scared," he said, gesturing to the stack of reports between them. "Every airline CEO in the country is calling, asking if they're next. Congress is feeling the heat. They're worried about jobs, about the optics of grounding another fleet." Selena listened, her hands folded calmly in her lap. "And what are you worried about?" she asked. David sighed. "That we won't move fast enough. That if we don't get ahead of this, we'll have another Stratus jet on our hands before the year is out." Selena slid a document across the desk. On the cover were the words Professionalism and Inclusivity in Aviation Safety, or PIA for short. Inside was the blueprint she had been drafting for weeks. It was a program that required airlines to treat culture as a critical safety component, subject to inspection and enforcement, just like engines or airframes. She spoke with quiet conviction. "We inspect every rivet on a plane. We should inspect every assumption in a cockpit. Bias, arrogance, poor communication. They are just as dangerous as faulty wiring. This program will make sure airlines understand that." David flipped through the pages, his brow furrowed. "You know what the lobbyists will say. They'll call it overreach. They'll call it political. They'll say culture can't be regulated. Culture is already regulated," Selena replied. "Every time we tell a pilot to follow crew resource management protocols, we are regulating behavior. Every time we require de-escalation training, we are regulating culture. The difference is, we've been letting airlines get away with the bare minimum. StratusJet proved where that leads." David studied her face. What he saw was not anger, but clarity, the steady fire of someone who knew the cost of compromise. Finally he nodded. "Draft the rollout. I'll back you." The next challenge was Congress. Selena sat at the witness table under the harsh glare of television lights. Senators shuffled papers, clearing their throats before launching into speeches disguised as questions. Some praised her courage. Others accused her of orchestrating the downfall of an airline for personal reasons. She waited patiently for each voice to quiet, then spoke with the same even tone she had used in that cabin weeks earlier. "This is not about one incident. It is about a pattern. We have data linking airlines with higher numbers of crew conduct complaints to increased rates of safety incidents. Disrespect is not just rude, it is dangerous. A captain who dismisses a passenger because of bias is the same captain who might dismiss a first officer warning about a storm. The stakes are lives." Her words settled over the chamber like a heavy truth. Some senators leaned back, chastened. Others scribbled notes, realizing the political tide was shifting. After the hearing, reporters swarmed her in the hallway, microphones thrust toward her face, questions flying in rapid succession. Dr. Carter, do you think the entire industry is rotten? Will more airlines be grounded? What do you say to the thousands of workers who lost their jobs? Selena paused on the steps, her voice carrying with measured strength. I grieve for every worker who lost a paycheck because of their leader's negligence. But the alternative would have been far worse. Imagine grieving for hundreds of families after a crash that never should have happened. That is why we act. Safety must never be compromised for expedience. The clip aired on every evening news broadcast. Ordinary Americans, many of whom had never thought about the culture inside cockpits and cabins, suddenly saw the link between dignity and survival. Letters poured into the FIA from flight attendants, pilots, mechanics, and passengers. Some thanked Selena. Others begged her to keep pushing. A movement was building inside her own mind. However, Selena wrestled with doubts. Late at night, when the city outside her apartment grew quiet, she replayed the faces of the StratusJet employees she had met during the investigation. The mechanic in Denver who whispered about fake engine checks. The young gate agent who admitted she had been told to ignore passenger complaints. They were casualties too, swept away by the tide of accountability. She asked herself whether she could have done more to protect them, but each time she returned to the same thought. If she had stayed silent, if she had accepted humiliation in seat 2B that day, then the rot would have continued unchecked. Silence, she reminded herself, is complicity. Back at FAA headquarters, her team began shaping the PIA program into a reality. Inspectors were trained to evaluate not just mechanical systems, but human systems. They observed de-escalation training sessions, graded them for realism, and flagged those that were hollow checkboxes. They pulled personnel files to identify patterns of misconduct. They interviewed junior staff who had never before been asked what they saw and felt. For the first time, airlines faced accountability for the invisible culture that guided every interaction in the sky. The pushback was fierce. Airline lobbyists launched an aggressive campaign, warning of skyrocketing costs and longer delays. Opinion pieces accused the FAA of social engineering. Anonymous emails threatened Selena personally, warning her to stop before she destroyed the industry. She read them with a mixture of anger and resolve. Threats were nothing new in her career. But now, with every step, she felt the weight of history pressing on her shoulders. One evening, as she walked out of the FAA building, a young woman approached her shyly. She wore the uniform of a flight attendant from another airline, her badge tucked into her pocket. Dr. Carter, the woman said, her voice trembling. I just wanted to thank you. What you did, it gave me courage. Last week I reported my supervisor for treating a passenger unfairly. Before StratusJet, I never would have dared. But now I know someone is watching. Someone cares. Selena smiled, placing a gentle hand on the young woman's shoulder. It takes bravery to speak up. Never forget that dignity begins with you. The exchange stayed with her long after. It reminded her why the fight mattered, why every sleepless night was worth it. By the end of the year, the PIA program was officially adopted. Airlines grumbled, but complied. New inspectors filled classrooms in Oklahoma City, learning how to evaluate culture alongside mechanics. For the first time, the human element of aviation safety was treated with the same precision as an engine check. Selena stood in the training hangar one morning, watching recruits walk past the hulking remains of StratusJet's old fuselage. A plaque beneath the logo read, Ceased Operations 2024, a case study in systemic failure. The sight filled her not with triumph, but with solemn determination. She whispered to herself, almost like a prayer. Let this be the last. Winter settled over Washington with its gray skies and biting winds, but the chill that reached Dr. Selena Carter's office came from the airline boardrooms, not the weather. By January, the Professionalism and Inclusivity in Aviation Safety program had begun its first wave of implementation, and the industry's response was ferocious. Harold Whitman, the ousted CEO of StratusJet, had disappeared into silence after the airline's collapse, but other executives filled the void with fury. Press releases warned of government overreach and the crippling of a vital industry. Former pilots appeared on cable news, declaring that dignity training had no place in the cockpit. Lobbyists marched into congressional offices with spreadsheets projecting financial ruin. Selena listened to each claim in hearings and briefings with a calm face. But inside, she felt the grinding pressure. She knew how easily politics could shift. A single vote, a single headline, could dismantle months of progress. She had faced turbulence before, but this was different. The forces arrayed against her were not just skeptical. They were desperate, and desperation could be dangerous. One evening, she returned to her apartment after a 14-hour day. She set her briefcase on the kitchen counter and leaned against the wall, the fatigue washing over her. Her phone buzzed with yet another message, this one from a senator's aide, warning that a bill to limit the FAA's authority over cultural inspections was being drafted. She exhaled slowly, her mind spinning. Was she pushing too hard? Too fast? The thought haunted her, but then she remembered the look in Claudia Reynolds' eyes that day in the cabin, the sneer of someone who thought the rules didn't apply. She remembered Captain Hastings' dismissive tone, the casual way he dismissed her concerns, and she remembered Ethan Morales, pale and sweating, too afraid to speak up. If she let the pushback win, those patterns would continue. The next morning, she stepped into a Senate committee room that buzzed with tension. Airline representatives sat behind the senators, whispering and glaring as Selena took her seat at the witness table. Senator Charles Greer, a longtime ally of the airline industry, leaned forward with a practiced smile. "Dr. Carter," he began, "you've certainly made headlines, but many of us are concerned. Isn't it true that your program could raise costs so high that small carriers will go out of business? Isn't it true that your new inspections might cause delays and cancellations for ordinary travelers? Are you willing to jeopardize the livelihoods of thousands for what some are calling social experiments?" Selena folded her hands, feeling the eyes of the nation on her. She let the silence stretch for a moment before answering. "Senator, the livelihoods of thousands are important, but the lives of millions are more important. This program is not a social experiment. It is a safety standard. StratusJet collapsed because they ignored professionalism. They ignored respect. They ignored the very foundations of safety. If we had not acted, the cost would have been measured not in dollars, but in funerals." Her words hung in the air. The senator shifted uncomfortably, but pressed on. "Still, some would argue that you are politicizing the skies." Selena met his gaze with steady calm. Respect is not political. Safety is not political. They are universal. When a plane is 30,000 feet in the air, arrogance and bias are not inconveniences. They are threats. The hearing became a media sensation. Clips of Selena's testimony circulated online, inspiring hashtags of support. But they also fueled her critics. Editorials accused her of arrogance. Anonymous opinion blogs painted her as a zealot bent on destroying the industry. One morning, she opened her inbox to find hundreds of emails, some filled with gratitude, others filled with venom. She closed her eyes, took a breath, and reminded herself that storms were a sign she was flying into headwinds, not drifting off course. Amid the chaos, she found allies in unexpected places. Ethan Morales, the young flight attendant who had once stood frozen in the galley, reached out to her office. He had been working with a new airline and undergoing intensive training under the PIA standards. In his email, he wrote, "I was terrified of losing everything after Stratus Jet, but now I see what real training looks like. I've learned how to de-escalate without fear. I've learned to speak up when something feels wrong. I want you to know, Dr. Carter, that your fight changed me. I will never again stay silent when dignity is at stake." Selena read his message 3 times, her throat tight. It reminded her that reform was not an abstract policy. It was changing lives, one person at a time. Yet her own nights grew heavier. Sometimes, as she prepared notes for another round of hearings, she would stare at her reflection in the darkened window and wonder how much of herself she was sacrificing. She thought about her parents, who had taught her to carry herself with dignity even when the world refused to see it. She thought about the students she mentored, young women of color entering aerospace fields, watching her every move as proof that they too could belong. Failure was not an option. The fiercest pushback came not from Congress, but from a coalition of airline CEOs who convened a press conference in New York. Standing shoulder to shoulder, they declared that the FAA's new program threatened the very survival of the industry. They warned of bankruptcies, mass layoffs, and rising ticket prices. One CEO, his voice sharp with anger, singled out Selena by name. "This so-called reformer has no idea how to run an airline. She is endangering our economy and our workers." The clip spread quickly, echoing across the networks and social feeds. That night, Selena sat in her living room, watching the replay. The words cut, not because they were true, but because they were designed to sow fear. She felt the familiar weight of isolation, the ache of standing alone against powerful forces. She closed her eyes and whispered to herself, "Stay steady, stay steady." The next morning, she returned to headquarters and found David Langford waiting outside her office. He handed her a folder. "These are the latest safety reports," he said. "Take a look." Inside were data sets showing a remarkable trend. Airlines that had implemented the first wave of PIA standards were already reporting fewer passenger complaints, smoother crew communications, and a decline in minor safety incidents. The evidence was early, but it was undeniable. Selena felt a surge of relief. Data was her anchor, her proof against rhetoric. She could stand before Congress, before CEOs, before the public, and show them that dignity was not just a moral imperative, but a measurable safety tool. That afternoon, she addressed a gathering of inspectors at the FAA field office. She spoke plainly, her voice carrying the quiet strength that had guided her through every storm. "You will face pushback. People will tell you that your work is unnecessary. They will tell you that dignity does not belong in a cockpit or a cabin. But you have the evidence. You have the truth. Hold the line, because every time you demand respect, every time you enforce professionalism, you are preventing a tragedy we may never see." The inspectors rose in applause, their faces alight with purpose. Selena felt the burden lift slightly. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself a smile. But as she returned to her office, her phone buzzed with a new alert. A lobbyist group had filed an injunction, seeking to block the PIA program entirely. A federal judge had agreed to hear the case. The battle was far from over. Selena sat at her desk, staring at the city lights flickering beyond her window. She could feel the fight stretching ahead, filled with more hearings, more accusations, more sleepless nights. A part of her longed for rest, for peace. But another part, the stronger part, knew that this was her calling. She whispered into the quiet, "Let them come. I'll be ready." The federal courthouse in downtown Washington was an imposing structure of marble and glass, its echoes filled with centuries of arguments about power and principle. On a brisk morning, Dr. Selena Carter stepped through its doors, carrying nothing more than a thin folder and the weight of an entire industry on her shoulders. The lawsuit filed by the airline coalition had reached the hearing stage, and the stakes were enormous. If the judge granted the injunction, the professionalism and inclusivity in aviation safety program would be halted, maybe dismantled completely. Selena had prepared for this moment with relentless precision, but the nerves still tightened in her chest as she passed through the metal detectors. Her attorney, a calm man named Marcus Caldwell, walked beside her. "Remember," he whispered, "you are not here to win a popularity contest. You are here to show that safety and dignity are inseparable. Speak with clarity. Speak with authority. The law is on your side." The courtroom filled quickly. Reporters lined the back rows, their laptops ready. Airline executives sat in expensive suits near the front, their expressions carefully composed, but their eyes full of contempt. Selena spotted Harold Whitman in the second row, his face pale but still carrying the smugness of someone who believed money could bend reality. He no longer had a company, but he still had allies eager to blame her for their misfortunes. Judge Eleanor Marsh entered, a small woman with sharp eyes who carried herself like a storm compressed into human form. The room rose in silence as she took her seat. "This hearing concerns the motion for injunction filed by the Airline Coalition versus the Federal Aviation Administration," she said briskly. "Counsel, proceed." The coalition's lead attorney launched into a speech thick with numbers and dire predictions. He warned that the new FAA program would devastate airlines, raise ticket prices, and harm the traveling public. He painted Selena as an overzealous bureaucrat who had exceeded her authority. "We do not dispute the need for safety," he concluded, his voice smooth. "But this program is not about safety. It is about politics." Selena listened without moving, her hands folded in her lap. Her heart pounded. But she knew this tactic well reframed the fight as ideology rather than fact. When the attorney finished, the judge turned to the defense. "Dr. Carter," she said, "you may address the court." Selena rose, her voice steady though her pulse throbbed in her ears. "Your Honor, safety in aviation is not an abstract idea. It is a daily practice. It is the discipline of respecting every regulation, every procedure, every person in that aircraft. Stratusjet collapsed because they ignored those principles. Their arrogance in the cabin mirrored their arrogance in the maintenance hangars, and that arrogance nearly endangered lives." She paused, scanning the room. The executive shifted uncomfortably. "This program," Selena continued, "is not political. It is statistical. Our data shows that airlines with high rates of crew misconduct also have higher rates of safety lapses. Respect and professionalism are not soft concepts. They are measurable predictors of danger. We can no longer afford to treat them as optional." Judge Marsh leaned forward. "Do you have evidence of these correlations?" Selena opened her folder, sliding forward charts and studies. "Yes, Your Honor. We conducted independent audits of airlines that adopted the first wave of standards. Passenger complaints decreased. Crew communication improved. Minor safety incidents declined. The numbers are clear." The judge studied the documents, her expression unreadable. The coalition's attorney objected, arguing that the data was preliminary. Selena countered calmly. All safety data begins as preliminary. The FAA has always acted when patterns emerge, not when disasters strike. We ground planes for hairline cracks in engines. Should we not act on cracks in human judgment? A hush fell over the courtroom. Even the reporters stopped typing for a moment. Selena felt the tension in her chest ease slightly. She had landed her point, but then came the cross-examination. The attorney rose again, pacing deliberately. Dr. Carter, are you aware that your program has already delayed flights and cost airlines millions in retraining? Do you consider it responsible to impose such burdens without congressional approval? Selena answered firmly. Safety regulations are rarely convenient. Seatbelts cost money. Engine checks cost time. But we enforce them because the cost of ignoring them is far greater. As for congressional approval, the FAA has clear statutory authority to regulate safety standards, including crew conduct. This program falls within that authority. The attorney smirked. So you alone decide what counts as professionalism. You alone dictate culture to an entire industry. Selena felt a flicker of anger, but kept her voice calm. I do not dictate culture. I enforce safety. And safety requires respect. A cockpit where a captain silences a co-pilot is unsafe. A cabin where a flight attendant lies about a passenger is unsafe. These are not opinions. They are documented failures that led to Stratusjet's collapse. We cannot ignore them. The judge raised a hand, halting the exchange. That is enough. I will review the evidence and issue a decision within 30 days. She struck the gavel. The hearing ended. Selena sat back down, her pulse finally slowing. Reporters swarmed as she exited the courthouse, microphones thrust toward her face. Dr. Carter, are you confident the judge will side with the FAA? What do you say to critics who call this government overreach? She stopped at the steps, the cold air sharp in her lungs. Cameras flashed. Voices shouted. She chose her words carefully. This is not about government overreach. It is about preventing tragedy. Every passenger deserves to fly in safety and dignity. That is the standard we are upholding. And that is what this case is truly about. The clip aired on every evening news broadcast. Some commentators praised her composure. Others accused her of defiance. But for Selena, the true battle was not in the headlines. It was in the silence of the judge's chambers, where evidence would outweigh noise. That night she returned home, exhaustion draped over her shoulders like a heavy coat. She poured a glass of water and sat at her kitchen table, staring at the steam rising from a forgotten cup of tea. The doubts returned, whispering in the quiet. What if the injunction succeeded? What if all her work unraveled? What if she had asked too much, too soon? She closed her eyes and thought of Ethan Morales. She thought of the inspectors she had spoken to, their applause echoing like a promise. She thought of the young women watching her, waiting to see if the world could change. Slowly, her doubts quieted. She whispered to herself, even if they stopped the program today, the truth is already out there. The industry has seen it. The passengers have seen it. They cannot unsee it. 2 weeks later, she received an envelope marked with the court seal. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The ruling was brief but decisive. The injunction was denied. The program would continue. Selena let out a long breath, relief flooding through her. But even as she smiled, she knew the battle was not over. The airlines would not retreat quietly. They had lost this round, but they would regroup. The skies ahead were still turbulent. Still, As she folded the letter and placed it on her desk, she allowed herself a moment of quiet triumph. For the first time in months, she slept through the night. The ink on Judge Marsh's ruling had barely dried when the skies themselves staged a trial of their own. Dr. Selena Carter was in her Washington office reviewing the latest round of FAA training audits when her secure phone buzzed with an emergency code. "Selena, it's David Langford," came the voice of the administrator. His tone was clipped, urgent. "We have a developing situation. Meridian Air Flight 482 en route from Denver to Boston. A passenger reported smoke in the cabin. The crew hesitated to act. Conflicting reports are coming in. Some say the flight attendant dismissed the complaint as exaggeration. Others claim the captain refused to investigate immediately." Selena's blood ran cold. "Do they have eyes on the source?" "Not yet," David replied. "ATC is keeping them at altitude. We've scrambled response teams to Logan. But what worries me is this crew's training record. Meridian only just began implementing the inclusivity and professionalism protocols. This is the first major incident under that framework. If they succeed, it proves the system works. If they fail..." His voice trailed off. Selena didn't need him to finish. If they failed, the airlines would seize on it like wolves. One disaster, and her entire program would be branded as distraction. She stood, her hand tightening on the edge of her desk. "Patch me into their operations center. I want to hear everything in real time." Within minutes, she was listening to the voice of Flight 482's captain crackle through the operations line. "Boston Center. This is Meridian 482. Cabin crew reports a faint odor near row 14. We've run through the initial checklist. No obvious source. Engine stable. All gauges normal. Passengers anxious." Another voice broke in. Younger. Tense, but steady. "Operations. This is First Officer Ramirez. Recommend we prepare for diversion as a precaution." Selena closed her eyes briefly, listening. The tone of the co-pilot was calm, firm, insistent. Not silenced, not brushed aside. That was already a good sign. Then came the voice of a flight attendant, relayed through the captain. "This is Leah, cabin crew." A passenger insisted he saw wisps of smoke near the overhead bin. "We investigated. Found a portable charger overheating. We've secured it in a containment bag. No flames, but strong odor. We recommend informing passengers and preparing for emergency descent if needed." The captain hesitated. We can manage this in-flight. No need to alarm passengers unnecessarily." There was a pause. Then the younger voice returned. "Sharper this time." "Captain, with respect, dismissing passenger reports delayed our identification by several minutes. Protocol requires full transparency. We need to communicate, reassure, and prepare." Selena leaned forward in her chair, heart pounding. This was the inflection point. In the old culture, the captain's word would have been law. But now, under the new program, every crew member was empowered to voice concerns. Every passenger report required respect. To her relief, she heard the captain relent. His voice was taut but clear. "Very well. This is Captain Ellis. We will divert to Buffalo as precaution. Flight attendants, prepare cabin for possible emergency landing." Selena let out a long breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The system had held. The culture was shifting. Within an hour, Flight 482 was on the ground in Buffalo. Passengers disembarked shaken but safe. The smell of burned plastic still lingering in their clothes. Reporters swarmed the gate, recording shaky cell phone videos of passengers praising the crew. A woman with tears in her eyes told cameras, "I smelled it first. I thought maybe I was imagining things." But when I told the flight attendant, she took me seriously. They found it because of that. They saved us because they listened. By evening, the headlines were everywhere. Crisis averted on Meridian 482. New training credited. Analysts on cable news panels replayed passenger interviews, pointing to them as living proof that respect could be a safety system. In her office, Selena watched the coverage with a mixture of pride and exhaustion. The doubts that had haunted her after the courtroom battle began to ease. For months she had argued that culture and safety were inseparable. Now the skies had provided a case study far more powerful than any statistic. Still, her satisfaction was tempered. She knew the airlines would not give up. Harold Whitman, disgraced though he was, had already been spotted lobbying senators to weaken the FAA's authority. The coalition of executives would regroup, recalibrate, and attack again. That night, Selena sat at her kitchen table with her glass of water untouched. She thought of Claudia Reynolds, the flight attendant whose arrogance had started it all. She thought of Captain Mark Hastings, who had dismissed her with paternalistic contempt. And she thought of Ethan Morales, whose honesty had spared him from ruin. She wondered what had become of Ethan. Had he found his footing in the new culture? Was he training others now? The thought comforted her, though a shadow of sadness lingered. Not everyone had been given a second chance. Her phone buzzed again. It was David. "Good news," he said, a rare warmth in his voice. "The president just called. She wants to meet with you tomorrow morning. She saw the coverage of Flight 482. She believes your program just saved 200 lives. She wants you in the Oval Office." Selena closed her eyes, her pulse quickening. She had never sought fame, never wanted the spotlight. But this was bigger than her now. The system was working, and the highest office in the country had taken notice. The next morning, she walked through the West Wing, past portraits of leaders who had carried the nation through crises. In the Oval Office, sunlight poured across the desk where the president stood waiting. "Dr. Carter," the president said warmly, extending her hand. "You've given this country a gift. You've proven that dignity is not just moral. It is practical. You've shown that respect saves lives. I want you to know you have my full support." Selena felt a wave of gratitude and responsibility wash over her. She thought of the young inspectors in training, of the passengers who trusted their lives to strangers, of the invisible threads that connected every takeoff and landing. "Thank you, Madam President," she replied softly. "But the work is far from done. We've pulled one thread, but there are many more. The culture of aviation must be rewoven from the ground up." The president nodded. "And you are the one to lead that." As Selena left the White House that afternoon, reporters shouted questions, flashes bursting like fireworks, but she hardly noticed them. She walked with a quiet determination, her thoughts already turning to the next audit, the next reform, the next fracture in the system that needed repair. In her heart, she knew the battle was only beginning, but she also knew something else. For the first time in her long career, the skies felt just a little safer. The applause that greeted Dr. Selena Carter outside the White House faded quickly once she was back in her office. Washington was not a city that allowed victories to linger. For every handshake, there was a shadow. For every public cheer, there was a whisper in a closed corridor. 2 days after her meeting with the president, a report crossed her desk that chilled her blood. A coalition of airline executives, led by none other than Harold Whitman in quiet partnership with 2 other carriers, had hired one of the most ruthless lobbying firms in the capital. Their goal was simple dismantle, or watered down the professionalism and inclusivity in aviation safety program. The ink had barely dried on Flight 482's safe landing, yet the battle was already shifting to the arena of politics. Selena sat at her desk late into the evening reading the briefings. She saw her name mentioned in memos, often with disdain. One draft statement described her as an unelected bureaucrat forcing social experiments on critical safety systems. Another briefing warned senators that her policies would cripple airline profitability and burden taxpayers. She pushed the papers aside, staring at the city lights outside her window. Her heart tightened with both anger and fatigue. She thought of the woman on Flight 482 who had smelled smoke. What if she had been ignored entirely? What if the overheated battery had caught fire? 200 lives might have been lost. Was that a social experiment? David Langford walked in without knocking. He carried 2 mugs of coffee, setting one on her desk. His face was stern, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of concern. "I know what you are reading," he said, "and I know what it feels like to have your work twisted into talking points. Do not let it hollow you out." Selena sipped the coffee, grateful for its warmth. "They are coming hard, David. They will paint me as reckless, as political. They will use every tool to discredit me, and they will do it loudly, with millions in ads, with senators in their pockets." David leaned against her desk, crossing his arms. "Yes, they will. But you have something they do not. You have proof. Flight 712, Flight 482. You have the data, the inspectors, the passengers themselves. This is not theory. It is reality." His words steadied her, but doubt still gnawed at the edges of her resolve. She remembered Captain Mark Hastings' smirk, Claudia Reynolds' sneer, the humiliation she had felt being escorted off Flight 712. Would Congress really care about dignity when lobbyists waived campaign donations? A week later, she found herself testifying before a Senate subcommittee. The chamber was filled with cameras, aides, and a row of stone-faced senators. The chairman, Senator Russell Keene, wasted no time. His voice boomed across the room. "Dr. Carter, do you not believe that by emphasizing so-called inclusivity, you are distracting crews from their core safety tasks?" Selena inhaled slowly, letting the silence build before answering. "Senator, safety is not separate from respect. A cockpit where a co-pilot is ignored is a cockpit where mistakes multiply. A cabin where passengers are dismissed is a cabin where warnings are missed. Flight 482 showed us that listening can save lives. That is not distraction. That is safety at its purest." Murmurs rippled through the audience. Keene frowned, flipping through his notes. Another senator, more sympathetic, leaned forward. "Dr. Carter, can you tell us what went through your mind the moment you were removed from Flight 712? Selena hesitated. The memory was still raw, but she knew vulnerability could be power if wielded carefully. "I felt small," she said softly. "I felt erased, as if my presence did not matter. But more than that, I felt fear, not fear for myself, but for what it meant if crews could fabricate threats to silence passengers. If they could do that to me, a federal official, what would they do to someone without a voice? That fear is why I stand here today." The chamber fell into a hush. Even Senator Keene lowered his gaze for a moment. Still, outside the committee room, the war continued. Ads began airing on cable channels showing smiling families, boarding planes with a narrator warning of unnecessary regulations costing you higher fares. Op-eds appeared in major newspapers claiming that the FAA was being hijacked by ideology. Selena became a target. Anonymous callers flooded her office with insults. Social media boiled with vitriol, Some posts openly racist, others dismissive. She scrolled past them at night, sometimes unable to sleep, her chest tight with the weight of it all. One night she sat in her living room staring at the darkened television. Her mind replayed the Senate hearing, the sneers in the lobbyist memos, the comments online. A question surfaced in her thoughts, uninvited and painful. Was it worth it? She closed her eyes, remembering the faces of passengers stepping off Flight 482 safe and alive. She remembered Ethan Morales, the young attendant who had admitted his fear but chosen honesty. She remembered the recruits at the FAA Center, bright-eyed and ready to serve. Yes, she whispered to herself. It was worth it. The next morning she called her communications director. I want to tell my story publicly, not through filtered hearings or hostile interviews. I want to speak directly to the people. Within days, a town hall was arranged in Atlanta, one of the busiest airline hubs in the country. The auditorium filled with passengers, aviation workers, and reporters. Selena stood at the podium, her voice calm and steady as she recounted what had happened on Flight 712, what nearly happened on Flight 482, and why respect was not a luxury, but a lifeline. She ended with words that would echo far beyond that hall. Airplanes carry not just metal and fuel, but trust. Break that trust, and you break safety itself. Dignity is not separate from survival. It is the foundation of it. The crowd rose to its feet in thunderous applause. Passengers who had once felt invisible stood taller. Mechanics nodded in agreement. Flight attendants whispered among themselves, some with tears in their eyes. The speech was broadcast live, clips spreading online with speed and fire. That night, even her harshest critics were forced to acknowledge the resonance of her message. Some still dismissed her as dangerous, but others began to hesitate, sensing the shifting winds of public opinion. Harold Whitman, watching from his private office, slammed his fist onto his desk. His empire was gone, his influence reduced, and yet Selena Carter's voice had grown louder than ever. He called his lobbyists, demanding more pressure, more attacks. But deep down, he knew the tide was turning against him. Back in Washington, Selena returned to her desk. Her inbox was flooded with letters from passengers, from crew, from young women who saw in her a reflection of their own struggles. She read them one by one, her eyes stinging with tears. Each story reminded her why she had chosen this path. Yet she also knew the fight was far from over. Lobbyists would regroup. Politicians would grandstand. The system would resist change. But she was no longer alone. The public had seen her, heard her, and many were ready to stand beside her. That night, as she looked out her window at the Capitol dome glowing in the distance, Selena whispered again to herself, "Yes, it is worth it. And tomorrow, I will fight again." The winter sun cast long shadows over the runways of Reagan National Airport as Dr. Selena Carter boarded a small government jet bound for Oklahoma City. She sat by the window, her eyes fixed on the horizon, her mind heavy with both triumph and burden. In just 18 months, she had gone from an exhausted passenger, humiliated for asking for water, to the architect of one of the most sweeping reforms in aviation history. The cost had been staggering, both to her personally and to thousands, whose jobs were swept away in the collapse of Whitman Air. Yet the gains were undeniable. When she arrived at the FOA's Mike Monroney Aeronautical Center, she was greeted by a hall filled with recruits. They were the newest class of aviation safety inspectors, the largest and most diverse group in the agency's history. Their faces radiated eagerness, anxiety, and determination. Selena paused before stepping onto the stage. She remembered her own early years, The doubt that clung to her every move, the way her intelligence was questioned before it was ever acknowledged. She thought of the passengers on Flight 482 and the chilling possibility of what might have been. The auditorium fell silent as she walked to the podium. She did not need a microphone. Her voice carried naturally, calm and clear, born of years of standing firm in rooms that wanted her silenced. "Look around you," she began. "This hangar holds the machinery of flight. Engines dissected, fuselages opened, hydraulic lines exposed. Every rivet here tells a story of discipline and precision. We spend countless hours inspecting these machines because we know a single fracture can lead to catastrophe. But for too long, we ignored the fractures in our human systems. We ignored the arrogance in the cockpit, the prejudice in the cabin, the negligence in the boardroom. Those fractures were just as dangerous because they corrode trust. And without trust, safety cannot survive." Her eyes swept across the room. "I was on a plane where a captain believed his authority exempted him from truth. I was on a plane where a senior attendant believed her bias outweighed policy. That plane never left the ground because I refused to bow. And when we pulled that thread, we discovered an airline rotted from within. From fake training modules to fraudulent maintenance logs, the lesson was clear. Dignity is not separate from safety. It is the first condition of it." The recruits leaned forward, hanging on every word. Some scribbled notes. Others simply listened, their expressions tightening as they felt the weight of responsibility settling on their shoulders. Selena continued, her tone softening. "You are here to become guardians. Guardians not just of engines and logbooks, but of the culture that surrounds them. When you walk into an airline's office, you are not there to check boxes. You are there to see if the culture respects truth. You are there to notice if a flight attendant has 19 complaints buried in a file. You are there to ask if a pilot listens to a first officer. These things matter as much as a faulty bolt or a cracked strut, because they are warning lights on the dashboard of human systems, and ignoring them is how disasters begin." Applause rippled through the hall, but Selena lifted her hand gently to quiet it. "I tell you this not to celebrate, but to remind, I did not bring down an airline. Their own choices did. I only held up a mirror. The truth did the rest. And truth will always prevail, if you have the courage to uncover it." After the speech, she walked the training floor. She stopped by a simulator where young attendants practiced de-escalation drills. The scenario showed a belligerent passenger refusing instructions. The crew communicated calmly, escalating only when absolutely necessary, their voices steady, their teamwork seamless. Selena smiled faintly. It was a small glimpse of the future she had fought for. That night, back in her hotel room, she opened a letter that had been slipped into her folder. It was from Ethan Morales, the junior attendant from Flight 712, who had once stood paralyzed between fear and conscience. His words were shaky but honest. "Because of you, I found my courage. I thought my career was over, but instead it was reborn. I now train others to speak truth even when it is hard. Thank you for not giving up on people like me." Selena set the letter on the desk and pressed her hand over her heart. Tears welled in her eyes, but they were tears of quiet gratitude. For all the venom, all the sleepless nights, this made it worth it. Weeks later, she sat before cameras again, this time not as a witness under attack, but as the keynote speaker at the International Aviation Safety Conference. Delegates from around the world leaned in as she laid out what had become known as the Carter Doctrine, the inseparability of professionalism, inclusivity, and safety. Her data showed direct correlations between airlines with toxic cabin cultures and those with higher rates of safety incidents. Charts proved what she had always known in her bones. Disrespect was not just immoral, it was dangerous. The Carter Doctrine was adopted across Europe, then Asia, and slowly, even resistant carriers in the Middle East and South America began to implement its principles. Training programs expanded. Whistleblower protections were strengthened. Passengers began to notice a difference, not in grand gestures, but in subtle shifts. A smile where there once had been a sneer. A pause to listen where there once had been dismissal. Meanwhile, Harold Whitman's empire disintegrated. Bankruptcy courts picked apart his airline. He sold his estates to cover debts. He was last seen living quietly in Arizona, a man who once commanded boardrooms now reduced to obscurity. His name became a cautionary tale taught in business schools. Arrogance disguised as efficiency is the fastest path to ruin. Selena, however, did not seek fame. She declined most interviews, preferring to let the work speak for itself. She spent her evenings walking along the Potomac, her mind filled with both peace and the memory of scars. She thought often of the humiliation of being called Mom in that cabin, the sting of being erased in front of dozens of eyes. But instead of anger, she now felt resolve. They had tried to make her small, and instead they had expanded her voice to the world. On the anniversary of Flight 712, she returned quietly to Chicago O'Hare. At Gate C-27, a small plaque had been installed by the FAA. It bore a simple inscription, "In memory of the day when dignity became safety." Here began the reform that saved countless lives. Travelers walked past without noticing, but Selena stood before it for a long time. She touched the plaque gently, closed her eyes, and whispered a promise. "I will never forget." Months later, as she prepared to retire from government service, she left one final message for her staff. Remember that power is not in the loudest voice, but in the steady hand that refuses to waver. You will face pressure, ridicule, even threats, but the truth is stronger. Always. She signed her name and leaned back, exhaling slowly. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine life beyond constant battles. Perhaps she would teach. Perhaps she would write. But whatever came next, she knew the skies were safer now than they had been before a simple request for a glass of water had changed everything. The story of Selena Carter would be told for decades, not as a tale of vengeance, but as a lesson in integrity. It proved that sometimes the smallest spark of injustice, when confronted with courage, could illuminate a vast landscape of hidden rot. And it proved that one woman, armed with quiet dignity and unshakable expertise, could hold an entire industry accountable. As her plane lifted off that final evening, she looked out the window one last time. The city glowed beneath her, but her gaze turned upward, to the endless expanse of sky. It was not just air and clouds. It was trust, responsibility, and hope. And with a steady heart, she whispered into the hum of the engines, "This is why we fight." Sometimes it takes the smallest spark, a glass of water withheld, to expose the deepest cracks in a system. Dr. Selena Carter's journey reminds us that dignity is not optional. It is the very foundation of safety and trust. Her calm strength dismantled arrogance. Her steady voice outshone authority. And her integrity saved lives far beyond that single flight. But her story is also a mirror for us. How many times have we looked away when bias played out in front of us? How many times have we mistaken silence for peace, when in truth silence allowed injustice to thrive? Discrimination has no place in the skies or anywhere. And yet, unless we confront it, Unless we choose courage over convenience, it will continue to take root. This story asks each of us to choose, will we be bystanders or will we be guardians of dignity? If this story touched you, let it not end here. Carry it forward, share it, talk about it, and remember your voice matters, even when the world tries to silence it. Don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel so you can be part of the next stories that challenge, inspire, and remind us that justice begins with truth.